In order to understand the material in Chapter 12 about the Phillips curve and the discussion about inflation and unemployment and whether there's a trade-off between the two, we need to go back to our models that we've been studying, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model in particular, in both the Keynesian or sticky price version as well as the classical version of that with price flexibility, and then discuss an intermediate case. So let me be clear about that. If we draw our aggregate demand, aggregate supply models, the price level, the CPI on the vertical axis, real GDP or Y on the horizontal axis. We've got aggregate demand. I'm going to draw two different cases here. And long-run aggregate supply. Long-run aggregate supply marks potential GDP. So it's Y with a bar over it. Potential GDP, the amount of output that could be produced at full employment. And then we have a horizontal line, the short-run aggregate supply curve. I'll put a little zero there, and the zero with the aggregate demand curves to me. That's where we're starting. So there's our short-run aggregate supply curve. And in general equilibrium, where we start, let's mark that with an A. All the markets are in equilibrium. If we're in the Keynesian model, we have sticky prices. If we're in the classical model, we have flexible prices. They adjust quickly. If we're out of equilibrium. So in this model, what we want to do is we want to think about what's the relationship between the price level, here this will be the starting price level, and real GDP, and then real GDP and the unemployment rate, since unemployment and inflation is what the Chapter 12 is about. We need to go back for just a moment to Chapter 3 and talk about something. If you go back and look toward the end of that chapter, Okun's law, just to be really clear about things. Okun's law is written as potential GDP minus the actual level of GDP over potential GDP equals 2 the actual level of employment minus the natural rate, or the level of unemployment at full employment. The point here is that there's a direct relationship between how far away actual GDP is from potential GDP and how far unemployment is away from the natural rate of unemployment or full employment. So, for example, if the actual level of GDP, Y, is less than potential GDP, that would be a recession, right? Then this is a positive number. This is the percentage, the percent of potential GDP where we're at, where the economy is at, how close to potential GDP, but it's below potential GDP in that case. So that's a positive number, right? So if Y is less than potential GDP, this side of the equal sign is positive. That means, right, this side of the equal sign has to be positive. Even forget about what the actual numbers are. But if this side is positive, it means that the actual level of unemployment has to be greater than the full employment level of unemployment, right? So recessions, this would be a recession, right, leads to higher unemployment. Right? In other words, there's a direct relationship between real GDP and unemployment. The lower the level of real GDP is, the further away from potential GDP we are, and the larger the unemployment rate is. So we just need to keep that in the back of our minds, because we're not going to have the unemployment rate in these graphs, but it's behind the scenes. So let's go back up to these graphs. If there is an increase in aggregate demand in the Keynesian model, an increase to the shift to the right in the aggregate demand curve, what happens is that the actual level of GDP becomes larger than potential GDP. This is a negative number in Okun's law. That is a negative number, which means that U is less than U bar. The actual unemployment rate is less than the full unemployment rate. We have low unemployment. But what's happened to the price level? So in other words, in this case, right, actual GDP increases, right? The unemployment rate goes down. But what's true? There's no change in the price level, right? There's no trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Only thing that happens is GDP goes up and unemployment goes down. More workers, right? In the classical model, if the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, right? Well, in the very short term, we get the same thing at, this is not a bar, right? The actual level of GDP, right, call it Y1, increases, and the unemployment rate would go down. We have a shortage of labor since we're beyond full employment, right? There are not enough workers around for firms to be able to hire. And what will happen is that the wages and prices will adjust upward, right? In that case, right? There's more demand for goods and services, right? Aggregate demand is out here. A supply, the available potential supply, is back here. And so what's going to happen is the price level is going to go up. So this is what we learned back in chapter 9. And when will prices, so prices will go up, increase in prices, that's inflation, right? And so when will prices stop going up? When we're back at potential GDP. So the impact of the increase in aggregate demand in that case, let's say it was monetary policy, increase in the federal in money supply, or reduction in interest rates by the Federal Reserve. The only thing that happens in this case, in the classical model, is that the increase in aggregate demand, right, shift to the right of aggregate demand, right? So this is, we're looking at what happens when there's an increase in aggregate demand. Aggregate demand increases. What do we get? We get an increase in the price level, and we're back to potential GDP, so that no change in real GDP, no change in the unemployment rate. So we get inflation, but no change in the unemployment rate. There's no trade-off between those two. Right? In the Keynesian model, we don't get any change in the price level. In the classical model, we don't get any change in the unemployment rate when there's a change in aggregate demand. At the end of chapter 10, and there's a video with the chapter 12 material that goes through and derives this, right? We show that in the real world, right, the business cycle fact back from chapter 8 is that when there's an increase in spending, we get some inflation and we get a reduction in unemployment. We get both. So the classical and Keynesian model, in one case, the short-run aggregate supply curve is a horizontal and doesn't change. Prices don't change; they're sticky. or at least not for a long time. In the classical model, prices change very quickly, and so we go from A to C. Here we go from A to B, right? So in the real world, there's some intermediate case. So let's take a look at that for just a moment, because that's really the basis for understanding the Phillips curve. So let's make this nice and big. Here's the price level. Here's real GDP, aggregate demand, long run aggregate supply. And short run aggregate supply the way we've seen it. Okay? So in one case, we essentially have a vertical aggregate supply curve, the classical model. In the Keynesian case, we have a horizontal short run aggregate supply curve, right? In the real world, it's more like this. So we're going to replace the horizontal short run aggregate supply curve with an upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. But still, where the lines cross represents general equilibrium, okay? And determines the price level and the level of real GDP, potential GDP. Okay. But now, what we'll see is in the idea here is that this short run aggregate supply curve is based on some price level expectation of P0. If aggregate demand increases, like in our case we just looked at, instead of going straight up the long aggregate supply curve or straight out the short run aggregate supply curve that's horizontal, in that case we end up with some increase in GDP, right? So there's real GDP increases, the unemployment rate, the actual unemployment rate goes down, and the price level, let's say this was 100, the CPI, right? We're expecting a price level of 100, and instead the price level turns out to be, I don't know, 110, right? It's bigger than 100, it's up here. We go from A to B. And so this is an unexpected change in the price level, leading to a reduction in the unemployment rate, increase in real GDP. And so the idea is that if there's an unexpected change, right, in aggregate demand, let's say, in this case, maybe because of an increase in the money supply by the Federal Reserve, right, that you can get a reduction in unemployment rate, but you got to pay for that with some inflation, right? This would be a 10% inflation rate in that case, 100 to 110. So you can trade off with a shift in aggregate demand. You can get lower unemployment, but you've got to pay for that with some higher inflation. So that's the idea, right? Between different points in different years, right? So if we were looking at the unemployment rate here and the inflation rate here, this negative relationship is what's called the Phillips curve, named after the gentleman who initially noticed this relationship in wage data in Great Britain. And later on, economists in the United States and other countries around the world replaced wage inflation just with the inflation rate, changes in the price level. Okay? So it seemed like you could decide, well, I want a low unemployment rate and I want a low inflation rate, I don't know, 2%, but or 1%, let's say, right? And we might have to have, I don't know, 6% unemployment rate. And if you wanted a 4% unemployment rate, then you might have to have not 1%, but maybe 5% inflation. Right? There seemed to be a trade-off between the two. And policymakers, right, macroeconomic policymakers, what they do is they shift aggregate demand. And that's what this graph up here represents, right? If you boost aggregate demand, you're going to get some inflation and a lower unemployment rate. Now, the challenge is that over time, people understand that, well, inflation was higher than I thought. The price level wasn't at 100, it turned out to be 110. And so people are going to adjust their expectations for prices. And as they do that, this short-run average supply curve is going to shift back to the left, right? So increased price expectations, increased inflationary expectations are going to shift this back to ultimately, let's say this is 115, ultimately we're back here at potential GDP. So in the long run, right, after inflation expectations adjust, there isn't any more trade-off. All you get is higher inflation. You don't get lower unemployment. You're just back to potential GDP. But that might take a while, and in the short run, maybe policymakers can get some reduction in unemployment by boosting GDP, by shifting aggregate demand, for example, increase in the money supply or the reduction in the real interest rate, maybe the Federal Reserve, right? Trying to carry out monetary policy. And so that in the long run, there isn't any relationship between unemployment and inflation. You wouldn't necessarily see this nice relationship. So the idea here is if inflation turns out to be higher than expected inflation, then the unemployment rate, right, can be lower, right, than perhaps the full unemployment rate, which means potential GDP can be higher, right, than the actual level of real GDP can be higher than potential real GDP. So in this case, the unemployment rate, the actual unemployment rate, is less than the full unemployment rate. So what that leads us to is this relationship, right? That the difference between unexpected inflation, like we just showed in that example. Unexpected inflation is related to cyclical unemployment, or the difference between the actual level of unemployment and the level of unemployment at potential GDP, or the natural rate, right? So this is called the natural rate of unemployment, U bar. Again, we can go back to chapter 3 for more information about that. And U is the actual level of unemployment, of the unemployment rate. The one we read about in the newspaper or hear about in the news. H is just a number, right? It's positive, it's a number that's positive greater than 0. It's a slope, right, of a curve, right? We're going to talk about that in just a moment. This is the difference between what people are expecting inflation to be and the actual level of inflation, right? So this is the actual inflation rate. This is the expected inflation rate. So if they're equal, right? If pi equals pi e, or if actual inflation equals expected inflation, then this minus this is 0, right, on this side. So this side of this equation here, right, of that equation, right, that has to be 0. H is a positive number, so the only way this can be 0 is if the actual level of unemployment equals the natural rate. Right? So, equals that, sorry. Right? So both sides of the equal sign are 0 then. So, if the unemployment rate equals the natural rate, means we are at potential real GDP. If inflation turns out to be greater than what was expected, this side is positive, then this side has to be positive. There's a minus sign out in front, so this part inside the parentheses has to be negative, and negative is a positive, right? So what does that mean? That means that the U, right, the actual level of unemployment has to be less than the full employment level of unemployment, or U minus U bar, right? If that's less than that, right, then this is going to be less than 0. And then minus H times U minus U bar has got to be greater than 0. Positive, right? Because this is a minus. Minus and a minus, right? Positive. So, if the actual level of inflation is greater than expected inflation, the actual level of unemployment is below the natural rate of unemployment. In other words, the actual level is low, right? And the higher is inflation relative to the expectation, the greater is the unemployment rate, less than the natural rate of unemployment. So that by itself suggests that maybe there's, as long as inflationary expectations, or this piece right here, as long as the expected inflation and the natural rate of unemployment aren't changing, that suggests that there's a direct relationship between inflation, a negative direct relationship, right? A negative relationship. Inflation, and the higher is the inflation rate, the bigger is this number, right? Then the lower is going to be this number, right? Because that makes this a bigger negative number, negative, and the negative is a positive. Okay? And so that would be the Phillips curve idea. Inflation. Unemployment looks like this, with a slope of minus H. That's for a given expected inflation and a given level of the natural rate of unemployment. So that looks a lot like what the inflation and unemployment data looked like in the 1960s. The nice Phillips curve that is illustrated toward the beginning of chapter 12. The problem is that from the 1970s on, mid-1970s on, there wasn't a nice negative relationship between the two. In fact, there seemed to be no relationship at all. So what we can do is say, we can look at what's happening to what might have caused that. It might have been a change in inflationary expectations, and maybe a change in the natural rate of unemployment as well, but in particular inflationary expectations. So in another video, we'll take a look at that and see what happens to that Phillips curve when expected inflation changes. Well, short answer to that is this: to the extent that this represents an equation that we can graph and then see if the actual data look like that, what it means is that this relationship was actually shifting around. So the actual dots that represent data from that period of time, from the 1970s onward, don't necessarily fall along a nice line, which means that for policymakers, they need to take account of inflationary expectations in particular, and can't just assume that this Phillips curve from the 1960s and earlier represents some kind of menu that they can use for policy making. So for example, if this is U bar, full employment, they would say, oh, okay, this is the level of inflation that goes with that. Maybe that's 4%, I don't know. And if we want lower inflation, we're going to have to put up with higher unemployment. Or if we want lower unemployment than what's at the full employment level, then we're going to have to put up with higher inflation. Instead, what we saw in the 1970s is both high inflation and high unemployment, and that had partly to do with changing inflationary expectations. We'll address that in another video.